Hello and welcome to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. This time, what I want to do is talk about assumptions, uh, working from the absolute bedrock of something, and how that then works towards assessing something or understanding what is going on so that you can make meaningful predictions. Now, when you start assessing something, your ability to make predictions with that assessment at the start before you have any data is essentially non-existent. You have to build from something. So you can take information from previous assessment practices and try to figure out what that is likely to mean. Then you go and test it, and then you go figure out if it's predicting the thing that you think it will predict. There are important terms with respect to assessment. Now, this is obviously more an educational assessment, but the terms do seem to cross over reasonably well to healthcare practices. When you're talking about reliability or the ability to consistently get a particular range of results. So the top result and the bottom result are the same distance apart consistently. So if the top mark is 60 and the bottom is 30, then what you would want to see if the top mark goes to 62, the bottom mark should be 32 as a general concept. There is also a discriminatory factor with respect to reliability or the ability to tell something that is from something that is not, something that is a good performance from something that is not a good performance. That is also a part of reliability. Then you have validity. Is this thing measuring what I say it's measuring? There are definitely times when you add measurement practices or you add categories to an assessment, and it's not meaningfully measuring anything new or measuring anything that matters. It's just another measurement, so it kind of dissolves. It's not meaningfully telling you anything anymore. There's also utility. Do I have the resources to actually do this assessment? Now, that obviously, again, is more in the educational sphere. However, with respect to clinical practice, it's exceptionally important. Do I have enough time to do these tests for the patient, regardless of the actual healthcare practice? Do I have the time? Can I actually do this? Okay, so what I'm going to do is for those who have video, I'm going to be sharing my screen. For those who don't, I'm going to do my absolute best to describe this. So what I want to do is walk through essentially how I got from point A to point B with respect to finding a particular paper, and then I want to talk about the paper itself. Okay, so something had come across my essentially my radar. I had seen this, and it is an article. I'll scroll all the way up. It is from the June 2024 edition. So in scientific publishing or in journal publishing, often they will put something out far before the date that it claims. So this is from the June 2024 edition of the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine. The title is Pseudoscience, a Skeleton in Osteopathy's Closet. Oliver P. Thompson and Carlo Martini are the authors. The publishing date was February 18th, 2024. I'm recording this on February 22nd, 2024. The full text is not freely available that I am able to identify, and it kind of doesn't matter for the purpose of what I'm doing here, because it's going from this to the article that I found that is available not necessarily in its fully published form, but in its fully written form. So the thing that I'll do is read through this one just for some commentary purposes on the implications. Pseudoscience is information presented as scientific, but on closer examination fails to meet established standards to be considered as science. So that's just saying, that's giving a working definition of how they're using the term pseudoscience. Pseudoscience has harmful effects on individual patient care and society more broadly. That's the claim they're making. I'm sure they at least attempt to back that up with what they write. You have to understand also, I just want to show, this is a short communication. This is a commentary more than anything else. It's not necessarily something that's backed by an experiment or by data collection. It's going to definitely point to reference sources that are making other claims that are able to inform this communication, but it's not necessarily experimental. It is a commentary. Okay? The next point here, there are historical, professional, and sociological factors which make osteopathy susceptible to pseudoscience. For them to be able to make that claim, they have to point to previously published research, which they do. At least you can see this in the reference list. These factors may facilitate the propagation of pseudoscientific claims by osteopaths. The incorporation of pseudoscience into osteopathy's knowledge base threatens the claimed legitimacy and credibility of the profession. Again, so that's a predictive claim. That is not necessarily something that is currently shown meaningfully, but the danger is there. It's definitely possible that some of the stories that are contained as explanatory within the osteopathic profession could harm credibility. This would be true of any hands-on profession that makes claims that are not observable in the environment which the practitioner works. So when a chiropractor says something about a very specific subluxation, they're probably incorrect, right? They will often have radiological evidence to some degree, but it's not necessarily indicative of the claim. It's a static image. The test that they're going to use is going to be a motion test of some form within a given treatment. So what they can say is it doesn't move here. They can't say it doesn't move on this particular facet of this particular vertebral union. They're just not going to be able to meaningfully make that claim, right? A massage therapist that tells you that they're palpating the QL is incorrect. An osteopathic practitioner who says the same thing is incorrect. A physiotherapist who makes the claim of arthritis, right? Now, physios are not necessarily going to do this based on general presenting information from a patient. You can see motion restriction. You can see a pattern of pain reporting based on variability in pressure systems, so variability in weather, as an early accepted clinical warning sign of arthritis. So if a physio says this is arthritis, there's a problem. If a physio says all of these signs point towards arthritis, I would like you to get an image to rule it out. There you go. That's the appropriate way to do it. So the claims that are outside of the environment of observation, that are deeper than the environment of observation, all have problems because assumptions must be made. Okay? The final point here, or the final implication, it is important that osteopaths are aware of pseudoscience and recognize it when it might be presented as scientific knowledge. So another way to say this is a highly certain claim that that has no ability to be as certain as it is. Right. So when somebody is palpating the base of the skull and they say that a rhythmic motion somewhere between 7 and 13 times a second is cerebrospinous fluid, well, they're not doing an appropriate job of ruling out thoracic respiration, because thoracic respiration is in that range for most people, and it would be palpable at the base of the skull, especially with a patient in supine, right? So they're highly certain that it's cerebrospinous fluid pulsation, and it is not thoracic respiration, and they have done nothing to rule out thoracic respiration. So the high degree of certainty where uncertainty should reign is a problem. Okay, so go through that, provide some commentary. I was looking at this, trying to find the full paper, didn't find the full paper, but I found, decent wave tops that allowed me to understand what the paper is, what it's attempting to do. Again, it's a commentary. It's not an experiment based. It's not a data collection based. It's kind of a narrative commentary. It says short communication, but it's probably more like a narrative commentary than anything else. I believe that these people are concerned about what they see within the profession and would like to advocate for a change, and this is a way to attempt to do that. Okay. What I did was I rolled down through the references because the references are fully available, and it allowed me to kind of peek through, see what they were drawing from, so see what they were building on for their commentary. And then I got down, where did I get down to? Where did I get down to? Where is it? I think I got down to, where did we go? Yeah, it was probably number 16 here, for those who can't see. It's Thomas Oliver P. Oliver Thompson is one of the authors here. So often what you're going to notice is that anybody, regardless of background, regardless of profession, is going to have an observable preference set, an observable set of interests. And when I saw that the author was interested in diagnostic reasoning, so the 16th reference here is by Thompson and Petty and Moore, Diagnostic Reasoning in Osteopathy, a qualitative study. So once I hear diagnostic reasoning, because of my personal background with receiving my Master's of Science in Health Science Education, And my thesis supervisor definitely being interested in diagnostic reasoning. And I mean, I'm definitely often off with respect to how I describe Dr. Sandra Montero's interest or empirical research program. It's whether it's clinical reasoning or diagnostic reasoning, that is a stumbling block that I admittedly run into often, even though I've interviewed her and she specifically talked about this, and you can see that in the first interview that I did with her for this podcast. So if you look Osteopathic Lyceum podcast, Dr. Sandra Montero, you'll find the first one and the second one that I did with her. But clinical reasoning, diagnostic reasoning, that sort of field, not necessarily specific to what my thesis supervisor does, but that general field is of interest to me. So I see diagnostic reasoning in osteopathy, a qualitative study, right? I immediately predict that that's going to be something where they asked people about how they went through that process. And then because it's a qualitative study, they're not necessarily looking at outcomes, they're not observing data, they're probably asking about the qualitative process, right? So then you can click on Google Scholar and it'll pop up, right? So I'll show you the articles as I go across the top of the screen in a moment. Then abductive reasoning in clinical diagnostics, not as interested in that. Oliver Thompson again, okay, same author. So this preference set is going to likely be reflected, especially if they are referencing work that they've done. This is going to be reflected in the paper. And the paper, this is the reference 18, Clinical Decision Making and Therapeutic Approaches in Osteopathy, Qualitative Grounded Theory Study. Right, so grounded theory is a methodology. When you see grounded theory and you do not see constructivist grounded theory would be considered more positivist, or believes that there is one reality that can be appropriately identified through appropriate experimentation, but the researcher is always the problem. So it's qualitative, so it's looking for qualitative information, which is probably extracted through observation or interview. And then they're going to do an analysis of that information, looking for themes that are stable between everybody that was observed. And then they're going to put forth what they call a theory. So it's essentially, it's not hypothetical deductive, it's a little bit more inductive. So you're pulling things into it. So in the strict definition of a theory, it's not as appropriate because this is the first step. Once you develop the grounded theory, then you would have to go and attempt to falsify it. You would attempt to look for edge cases which would disprove the theory, or you would then adjust it so that it would be more broad. So it doesn't start from a hypothesis, it starts from observation. So it's a little bit more, believe, appropriately termed inductive. And this is me just riffing and providing some commentary before I show you how I got to the place that I got to. I think the next one was that one? Yeah, that was Clifford. Okay. So then I got to number 19, exploration of the clinical reasoning used by registered osteopaths in their choice of therapeutic approach. Very similar to the previous one. Yeah. Australian osteopathic practitioners' perceptions of clinical relevance of anatomy. That was just sort of interesting. That didn't necessarily get me anywhere. It's just interesting. So that's a paper, if you're interested, you can look at. And then as I rolled down, I got to number 23, methods of assessment used by osteopathic educational institutions. I happen to be very interested in educational assessment. I happen to be very interested in what's happening in the world of osteopathy, so that seemed like a really good idea. So I ended up clicking on the Google Scholar, and then from the Google Scholar, I clicked on the Google Scholar, and then from the Google Scholar, I clicked on the full text PDF. But here, I could have just clicked on the full text PDF. I just decided to make it more confusing for myself. So what I want to say is when I got to this, the presentation of this full text, it's missing all the figures. So this is not the full version, but it is the full written process. It says the publisher's official version can be found at journalofosteopathicmedicine.com/issue/blah, blah, 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 blah. Anyways, note that access to this version, the full version, may require subscription. Okay, so what they did here, you'll see, I'll go through the abstract. Methods used for assessment of students in osteopathic teaching institutions are not widely documented in the literature. So that's the gap, right, or the problem. A number of commentaries around clinical competency assessment have drawn on the health professional assessment literature, particularly in medicine. So again, they're talking about commentaries there. They're not talking about things that empirically observed or attempted to test anything. The objective, to ascertain how osteopathic teaching institutions assess their students and to identify issues with the associated with the assessment process. The design, series of focus groups and interviews was undertaken with osteopathic teaching institutions. Participants, 25 participants across 11 osteopathic teaching institutions from the United Kingdom, Canada, Italy, and Australia. The results, 4 themes were identified from the focus groups: assessing, processes, examining, cost, efficiency. Institutions utilized assessment types such as multiple choice questions and written papers in the early years of a program and progressed towards the long case assessment and objective structured clinical examination in the later stages of a program. Although examiner, cost, and training were common themes across all the institutions, they were perceived to be necessary for developing and conducting assessments. I'll read the conclusion. At least as presented in the abstract, most institutions relied on traditional assessment methods such as the long case assessment. However, there is an increasing recognition of newer forms of assessment such as the portfolio. The assessment methods employed were typically written assessments in the early years of a program, progressing to long case and objective structured clinical examination format assessments. Now, I'm not going to go through this full paper. It's 61 pages. It is double spaced. There's a lot of gap in it. So it's not really 61 pages, but it's 61 pages in presentation. I'm definitely not going to go through it, but what I do want to do is point to a few things. So I think this paper, for what its purpose was, did a decent job. They went out and ask people who were involved in osteopathic education how they were assessing people. One of the things that's definitely noted here within this paper, if you choose to read it, you will find this, that the choice of assessment methods is often driven by the requirements of some form of administrative governing body. So based on what the administrative governing body puts forth as a requirement, that is what these assessors will conform to because they are required to. This gives me the opportunity to note that the objective of an administrator and the objective of an educator are not the same. They are completely different things. This develops tension. The tension that is built between an administrative requirement and the outcome need of an educator means that the methods utilized for educating and for assessing will not necessarily be the ideal ones for the educational outcome. They will be the ones that represent the tension between the administrative requirement and the educational outcome. This is a fight consistently for those who care about assessment processes. Assessment processes require validity. They require to be measuring the thing they say they're measuring to get the best outcome from that process. The administrator or the administrative requirement is not the same. The administrative requirement is to ensure that it is recorded according to the administrative requirement. The administrative requirement doesn't require the same level of validity for outcome goal educationally in assessment as the educator does. Right? That's a lot of words. Basically, the administrator is looking to cover butts. The educator is looking to take novice to acceptable level of skill. The administrator is going to say that the administrative requirement is going to cover butts and prove that. However, the administrative process is often going to take attention, time, and effort away from the educational process. Okay. Specific examples of this are not necessarily reasonable to talk about, especially to be respectful, but that tension is chronic and constant. What you will see as a result of that, and I can point to this in what's written in the conclusion here, is that osteopathy as a profession, in what is available, at least with the observations presented in this paper, is exceptionally far behind on what we better understand now in assessment processes. And the term is portfolio. So blah, 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 blah. I'll read this sentence again. Most institutions relied on traditional assessment methods such as the long case assessment. However, there is increasing recognition of newer forms of assessment such as the portfolio. That portfolio, right? So you'd have to dig into the paper, but that portfolio, the term immediately rings bells for me, which is going to be based on competency-based medical education. Competency-based medical education, or competency by design, is not new. It doesn't change the details of the education. It changes the details of the assessment approach. Competency-based medical education, trying to create a portfolio, is trying to gather a much larger data set that is much more representative of the individual, because the larger data set is likely more predictive of what that individual is going to do when compared to single summative assessment approaches. A single summative assessment approach is an OSCE, or an objective structural clinical exam. It's going to have what is believed to be appropriate measurement interventions, so appropriate stations to test whether or not the person can do what we say they can do, but it's a single data point. That single data point is always marred by the reality that somebody might just be a bad test taker. They might have had a horrible event happen recently that makes them a worse test taker than normal. Whereas if you have data aggregated over time about a person, you can better understand their general arc from novice to competent or novice to expert. You can better understand their consistent level of performance as opposed to their individual moment level of performance. And that is definitely talked about in this paper. That portfolio is often, at least in the administrative settings of medical education, taken towards the competency committee. So it's not one person making the decision, it's many people looking at that portfolio and saying, okay, this is what I see. This is the good, this is the bad, this is what can improve. Further within a competency portfolio, there is much more formative assessment. So assessment, the term is assessment for learning. You assess somebody, you see how they're performing, and then you provide them feedback so that they can improve that performance. And then the way that you would capture the improvement of the performance is the subsequent formative assessment. So what you would be looking for is mistake A on test 1. If mistake A happens on test 2, there's a problem. If mistake B happens on test 2, we see the removal of mistake A. If at any point in the continuous formative assessment process we see mistake A again, then we know that something happened. If we see it once, it might be a blip. If we see it 5 more times, we know that mistake A is chronic, okay? And we know that it didn't get solved. So we can start to see the incidence of an error and the removal of that error, especially across time. If the removal of the error across time is consistent, then we can have greater confidence that it's gone and that it will not be committed again. So a consistent formative approach generally allows for better confidence in the prediction that somebody is a safe and capable practitioner. Okay. This is not understood by regulators. This is not understood by administrators. This is definitely not understood by the osteopathic profession, as is evidenced by the assessment practices. Something such as a short or long case study is so far removed from osteopathic practice, it's almost asinine that anybody uses it, okay? A long or a short case study is somebody writing either in the form of typing or pen and paper or pencil and paper, whatever writing implement or writing interface you have, or spoken interface, that they're just telling you what they would do. This is like somebody at a party telling you, you know, if that guy said that to me, I'd totally whoop his ass. That's insane. That is a ridiculous thing to say. If I give edge cases, it makes it more obvious how silly case reports or case studies as assessment methods are for osteopathic practice. They are completely removed from the environment of practice. Okay, that's somebody thinking, that's somebody saying what they would do, not somebody doing what they do. Okay, if you're going to assess a physical performance that involves another human being, you should assess the physical performance with the practitioner or the person, the learner, and another human being. You should not assess what they say they would do. You should assess what they actually do, okay? Anatomical multiple choice tests, physiological multiple choice tests. Yes, an administrative body would require that you prove at a single point in time that somebody has certain level of understanding of anatomy and physiology. That single point in time, in a very unfortunate way, does not prove that that person understands anatomy or physiology. You would want multiple tests of the same information over time to see if you see an arc towards improvement and stabilization of knowledge. Okay. Multiple choice tests are actually the most valid and the most reliable tests you're going to have because the questions are stable and you can check them across a large group of people so you can see how consistently people score at a certain level or within a certain range. Multiple choice tests are very, very good for written information or for knowledge assessment of conceptual information. They are not good at all for assessing physical performance. Physical performance should be assessed by observing physical performance. Okay. So what I'm going to do, at least for those who can see this, is I'm going to stop the share here. So we're talking about being confident that somebody can do what you say they can do. We're talking about changing assessment practices within a profession. We're talking about the profession borrows assessment practices from other professions because, unfortunately, in almost all professions, assessment is not part of the native expertise in that profession. Assessment of knowledge, assessment of performance is not, or at least educationally, is not part of the expertise package of osteopathy. It's not part of the expertise package of massage. It's not part of the expertise package of physio. Many of these organizations, many of these professions will hold their training within other institutions that can borrow that expertise. Now, one of the challenges is somebody who's an expert in assessment doesn't understand the profession, so they'll create what is a valid and reliable assessment, but it doesn't necessarily test the profession properly because they haven't gone to bedrock of the performance requirements of that profession. Okay, which means that there's assumptions that have been made at varying points that are made in good faith, but are made in error that is not detected. So what I want to do here is tell you what I would claim, not necessarily saying that I am absolutely correct, but what I would currently claim based on my current understanding is the absolute bedrock of osteopathic practice. First of all, it's physical. You must test it by observing physical performance. The end user of osteopathic treatment is the patient or the client or the person you are providing the physical intervention to, whichever terms you prefer, don't make you mad, or your administrative governing body require you to use, right? So I'm acknowledging variability there, such that the observation of the physical performance of the learner must include observation of the physical response of the patient or the client or the person you're providing the physical intervention to. You need to see what the patient is doing. You need to see how they move when they are initially assessed, how they move when they are subsequently assessed. You need to see whether or not they are showing discomfort, whether they are showing guarding, whether they are displaying signs of pain. So this relates back to discomfort. So this is the same construct. I'm just riffing, so I'm saying it at a separate point in time. So you need to be observing whether or not that individual is making noises that are abrupt in response to abrupt stimuli. They're making faces that are abrupt in response to abrupt stimuli, or they are making large movements abruptly in response to abrupt stimuli from the learner, the practitioner, whatever term you want to use. So any assessment must be built on that. The claim that I generally make is that the thing that differentiates osteopathy from other professions is the barrier concept, and the barrier concept may be described as don't make the patient say ouch, right? So you can add tension to something without them abruptly responding. You can remove tension from an area, so that's indirect, so that there is a change in that and they don't say ouch. So you're just trying to avoid them saying ouch. If that is a fundamental bedrock hallmark of osteopathy, then you must observe the practitioner doing that. Okay, so assessment practices. So if you're assessing how somebody assesses or diagnoses or generates a clinical impression, then they need to use tests that do what they say they're doing. This, my arm does this, just kind of raises maybe, you know, below shoulder level. So let's just say I take my hand from beside my hip to below shoulder level. That does not test shoulder flexion. That arm needs to go as high as it can go to test shoulder flexion, how well shoulder flexion is doing. Okay, so if somebody takes the arm up as far as it can go, there's obvious restriction. They're nice and gentle about it. The patient doesn't say ouch. The patient doesn't protect themselves, but you get to a definite restricted end range. Then that's a valid test. So I need to know that the student is testing appropriate ranges of motion and that the patient is not protecting themselves or saying ouch. Okay, that I need to see that. And I need to see that consistently. I can't see it once and never see it again. I need to see that consistently because that is a hallmark of osteopathic practice. If somebody attempts to develop an understanding of the shoulder by a passive shoulder flexion in supine to identify it, and then they test it in a different position, I do not believe them. That is not valid. Those are two different tests. While they may be testing the same motion, conditions are different, the context is different, it is not the same test. They did not appropriately reassess. Okay. So the only way that you can believe that somebody is assessing appropriately and understanding what they found and what changed is if they use the exact same test, the same way that they did to find it as they did to prove that it either changed or it did not change. Then, as far as how you're interfacing with the patient or the technical application, you're talking about where is the patient with respect to the practitioner, or where is the practitioner with respect to the patient, and how is the patient responding. Those are the fundamental bedrock things that you have to see consistently. So when you do an OSCE and you're asking about how do you treat the shoulder, how do you treat the neck, how do you do this, how do you do that, you might be able to pick up information on it, but what you're saying is at the top of your hierarchy is I want to know that they can, at one moment in time, treat the neck the way that I like. That is not testing a student. That is not testing whether or not they can appropriately perform. So you want to test them regularly and try to see the idealized performance or as close to it as possible in a stable way across time as you can. So my simple suggestion is if you're attempting to advocate on behalf of osteopathy and you're attempting to advocate to administrative regulatory bodies, don't advocate for using the methods that somebody else uses. Don't advocate for using the methods that medical professionals use, that surgeons use, or that doctors uses. Abstract the framework from which they're working and the details they hang on it. So to have an assessment practice for a surgeon, depending on the form of surgery, you have to see the details of the surgeries, right? But the framework is, are they safe consistently, right? That's the framework. So if you abstract, are they safe consistently, you can create a detail-based approach that is unique to the osteopathic profession. Don't say we're using the same methods as the doctors. Don't say we're using the same regulatory framework as another profession. Prove that you know the fundamental requirements of your own profession and prove that the details of your assessment have the proper framework that to be hung on and that they are the right details. Somebody being able to recite anatomy while working with a patient does not prove that they're safe practitioners. It proves that they can do circus tricks and that they can divide their attention for a period of time and not harm the patient at best, right? So that's not an appropriate framework. The appropriate framework is no matter what I ask them to do and no matter when I ask them to do it, are they hitting these general things? Are they testing proper ranges of motion? Are they using the same test to reassess as they did the first time? Are they handling the patient better? And then with respect to reassessment, is there change? If there is not change from the initial test to the second test or the reassessment, then they are not functioning at the appropriate level. That is really the fundamental framework of osteopathic practice. But people are in tension or in a tense relationship with the administrator because the administrators want to see what other professions or something similar to what other professions do to prove to the public that, oh, you guys are just as good as this other profession as far as the test that you use. It's not the right thing. The right thing is to understand the absolute fundamental groundwork or the framework or the bedrock of the profession and assess according to that. The highlight of osteopathy is the barrier concept. Don't make them say ouch. That needs to be observed in all interfaces with the patient, right? They actually need to test the ranges of motion that they say they're testing. Otherwise, any assessment method that that person uses is just not valid. For it to be valid and reliable, they need to use the same test to find something as they do to reassess it. Okay, so these are considerations. If you look at what is happening within the profession at the moment and the people who are advocating in varying locations and varying jurisdictions for the profession, they're advocating in ways that does not appropriately respect the bedrock of the profession. That is my claim. I have the opportunity to acknowledge uncertainty in what I claim as the bedrock of the profession. I have the opportunity to be swayed one way or the other. But what I can say is, based on the observations I'm able to make, is that, and partially informed by the paper that I presented earlier, that osteopathy doesn't understand its own fundamental framework. It doesn't understand best practices in assessment. That's a normal problem. That is not an abnormal problem. That is not a knock on osteopathy. I happen to have information that is closer to what is ideal assessment practices. I can't of myself say, or I can't say of myself that I know what assessment should be. I can say that I have more information than I observe others have, that I think I understand it at a more appropriate level and can devise an assessment strategy that would be more appropriate for actually figuring out what the heck you want to figure out with respect to osteopathic practice or predicting safe and effective osteopathic practice. I do not see those things instituted in any other locations or in any locations within the osteopathic profession, which I do find to be a fundamental flaw. So if you want to advocate on behalf of osteopathy and you want to be at a high level able to say, yes, these are safe and effective practitioners, if you use the assessment practices that are being used now, you do not know you are wrong in your advocacy, but you are dead wrong in your advocacy about this profession. You are very wrong. And I am one person with one viewpoint on this that is aggregated from the viewpoints of many others. And I obviously have reason to believe that I'm fairly accurate about what I'm saying. But if you're advocating on behalf of osteopathy with the assessment practices that are currently used, you are building in an assumption and a flaw that others will not detect. Again, I am but one person. I'm telling you that I detect it, and I'm telling you that it is not difficult at all to do a better job. Figure out the absolute bedrock of the profession, what the actual environment of performance is, assess the actual environment of performance, assess the physical performance and characteristics of the practitioner or the learner, and assess the responses of the patient. They are together. The patient is the end user, the practitioner or the learner, the whatever term you want to use, is the person who generates the intervention, but the patient is the end user of the intervention. So the patient must be monitored with respect to how the practitioner or the learner is working. Practitioner and the learner can do it really good, do all these technical things really good without the patient, but with the patient, they screw up. If they screw up, they're no good. So you have to observe both. That is my broad framework suggestion. I absolutely have ways to do this. I absolutely have instruments that I can share that would allow you to figure this out in a stable, observable way across time. Don't need to share those right now, but it is not a hard thing to do. If you understand those concepts, if you can abstract those concepts appropriately and hang the right details on them, you can create an assessment program for almost anything, but you have to understand it. This is, as I noted, why many programs are associated or housed within larger institutions where you have the experts within the profession that you're training and you have the experts in assessment, but they just don't necessarily understand the same thing and they may not speak the same language. So the assessment that's created may be a very valid, reliable assessment, but it may not be assessing the thing that needs to be assessed. So I happen to have what I believe is an acceptable level of both of those pieces of information. So I can make these points, I can have this conversation, and I can provide a framework from which you can build an appropriate assessment set. Now, I completely understand that it's highly unlikely that most people who would engage in listening to this podcast will not have these concerns or will not necessarily be engaged appropriately. But for those of you who are, I'm telling you, you're not assessing as you could or as well as you could. And any advocacy that you make upon the current assessments has major built-in flaws. There is no osteopathic training that I am aware of that can, throughout the world, that can meaningfully, currently say that they have produced a predictably consistent, safe, effective practitioner, not because they don't produce them, but because their assessment methods don't allow them to make the claim. They do produce them. They do produce good practitioners. They just can't make the claim based on assessment methods. But that is not interesting to everybody. What I will say, just to reiterate, case, long case, and short case assessments or tests are just not physical tests. They have no appropriate relationship to the practice of osteopathy. Don't use them anymore if you can influence anybody. Written tests for the practice of osteopathy are foolish. Written tests or word-based tests or cognitive tests for anatomy and physiology and other stuff like that, completely fine, totally fine, quite acceptable, good ways to do them. But stop trying to test osteopathic competency in a written form. It's foolish. It's just ridiculous. Don't do it. Anyways, hopefully for those of you who may engage with that and find it interesting, it was useful. Otherwise, if you have listened, hopefully it was also interesting and useful. And we will talk again soon.